coming to the Ag Data seminar series. So today we have another of the wonderful talk that ahead of you. That is we have Dr. Shiraz from ECE, and you guys. So it's one of our own professor here. But I just want to briefly introduce him and so he is a Mary Gordon professor. It's a named professor in the ECE department, and he received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and then you did your postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And then he dashed in here and there through the different places. And you at one point you worked in Canada,
Yep.
right? And but regardless, he's well recognized, and he has the career award from NSF, and has multiple awards from the university level and other places. But one of the other hat that he's probably going to put on today as well is that he's also the director for the ICON program, which you haven't, you should look it up. It's in a group that's really doing well. They secured $20 or $30 million just in the last couple of months. On the way. Okay. Well, I heard the great news that again, it's in a big group that are doing a lot of interesting stuff. So the idea here is that inviting them come over and talking to digital forestry, and then I'm going to make notes, lots of notes, and thinking about how we can work together. So without further ado, would you take over the floor?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me here. Yeah, so I'm Freas. I'm an ACE, as Simon said. So I'm also co-director of the Institute for Control Optimization and Networks. So this talk that I've got today is mostly a technical talk about, some of the ideas that we think about in terms of algorithms for distributed data gathering, information processing, and things like that in networks, which I thought might be of interest given the theme of the seminar series, right? The data-driven aspect of it. But just to give you a quick overview of ICON, broadly speaking, controls, autonomy, optimization, networks, these are very cross-cutting fields. They're not restricted to any single discipline. And so Purdue had a long history of strengths in autonomous systems. So if you went back to the 1950s and 60s, Purdue was really the place to be for autonomous systems and controls, especially with the space race. But since then, there hasn't been a center for autonomous systems on campus that brings together multiple faculty under a single umbrella. So we started ICON 3 years ago or 4 years ago during the pandemic to really be a home for autonomous systems and networks and optimization and control. So we started out pretty small, about 20 faculty from across engineering. We've grown to about 90 faculty now within ICON. So it's really, you should view us as a one-stop shop for any questions or collaborations you might be interested in that deal specifically with autonomous systems or, distributed sensing, algorithms or technology, things like that. So if you're looking for opportunities to collaborate, if you've got grants you want to go after, you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to connect you to the right faculty within ICON to collaborate with you. So what I was going to talk about today was going to focus a little bit on my own research. The seminar series is focusing on data, and I know digital forestry, there's going to be a lot of data, distributed sensor networks, things like that. So I wanted to give you a little bit of perspective on the types of approaches that we use in my discipline, control systems, to be able to think about these things. And in particular, I kind of changed the title up a little bit. I wanted to think a little bit about resilience in terms of this kind of distributed information processing and coordination. So in particular, if you've got these large sensor networks or other, even mobile networks, drones, and so forth, if you've got parts of the network that don't behave the way they're supposed to, so that could be due to faults, right? So they break and they drop out of the network, or more maliciously, maybe there's some compromise of these nodes. A second here. Okay. Oh, there it goes. It's fire truck. kids these days, right? I don't understand their music, just like my dad didn't understand my music. So, so yeah, if you have nodes that are compromised and that are not following the algorithms you expect them to, so there's data that's corrupted, you don't want that to corrupt the entire data set or all the decisions that the entire network's making. So how do we think about resilience in the context of these large scale networks? So I was gonna, that's kind of the focus of the talk. So it is a technical talk, but stop me anytime with questions. So this is the general setting, right? So is there a way to get rid of this?
I'll look at that.
Yeah, sure. So you've got some, large scale network of agents operating in some given environment. So that could be for environmental monitoring or surveillance of an area. It could be, more generally smart factories or smart cities or even social networks, right? You've got nodes which indicate people in these systems, and they're all kind of looking at a similar environment, but they may be looking at it in different ways or getting information from it in different ways. And the key idea is each individual node in this network has only a small view of the entire system. It's not able to see everything. And so it's gathering data, right? If it's a sensor network, each sensor is gathering maybe local data or observing part of the environment. And these nodes have to work together to be able to make sure everybody understands what's going on. And there are various challenges with this kind of setting, right? So other than the fact that they have very partial information, when they're exchanging information with these other nodes, they have to do it via these communication links, right? Which may be lossy, right? And the network may be changing over time. So the links may go up or down. And furthermore, you may have, as I said, certain nodes that don't follow the algorithm. So you may have adversarial nodes or faulty nodes in the network. So the sort of general area of research that I participate in and that I'll describe today talks about how do we define algorithms for these nodes so that when they run these algorithms, they exchange information with each other, they're looking at the system. We want to design these algorithms in such a way that all the good nodes, the nodes that are still functioning properly, learn what they need to learn about the environment, right? So if you want to take certain actions, you want to make sure they can learn that information. Okay, so there are various specific instances of this problem. So if you were to look up the literature, you'll see these kinds of terms, right? So the simplest version is called distributed consensus. I'm going to use that as sort of a nice illustrative problem to describe some of the key ideas. The idea in distributed consensus is that each node has some local static measurement, right? So imagine you've got a sensor network, each sensor measures temperature where it is. Okay, and these nodes have to work together to compute, let's say, some function of that. The average temperature, right, what that they measure. Or you can talk about distributed optimization, which is a more general version of this problem where maybe each sensor has gathered a ton of data and they're trying to fit some parameter to all the data that they've gathered, some sort of linear regression type of problem, right? So each node has some function that is trying to minimize in order to be able to fit this parameter set to this data, but they have to work together because no node has access to all the data, right? So how do I leverage data that other people have gathered to collectively minimize the set of functions that we're trying to minimize? State estimation and hypothesis testing, I'll touch on this as well during the talk. This is when you have some sort of state in the environment that's potentially changing over time in this context, right? So something is evolving over time, or you're trying to track something moving over time. How do you help these agents track that moving quantity in a way that you're guaranteeing everybody actually tracks that thing? Okay, and then hypothesis testing, there's a set of things that could be true about the environment or about some object that you're monitoring, and you're trying to figure out what is that thing, what is the ground truth about the environment. Okay, so these are kind of canonical problems. They've received a ton of attention in various communities, including control theory, which is my point. So let me, look at this consensus problem and hopefully give you, this is meant to be a tutorial talk. So give you a sense for the types of approaches and perspectives that people bring to this problem. So, this is a mathematical field. So we work with the mathematics of graph theory as a way to describe these big networks. So you've got a network G, right, which is a set of nodes, which is denoted B, B1 through Bn. So depending on the context, that could be sensors or robots or people or computers, whatever you'd like. And then you've got edges between the nodes, which indicates whether the nodes can talk to each other, right? So if there's an edge from here to here, that means this node can send information to that node. Okay? What that information is may depend on the constraints on that edge, but in general, there's some way to convey something on that edge. And then each node in this baby problem, let's say, has access to some local information. Like I said, maybe it's a temperature measurement that each node is. Okay, and the consensus problem is that all nodes have to come to an agreement on some function of these initial values. Okay, so, one way to do this might be to say, well, why don't you have all the nodes just send all their information to some one node in the network who collects all those values, adds them all up, and tells everybody what the average is. So that's certainly fine. You could do that, but there's some challenges with that, right? You may not have a central coordinator. You may not be able to communicate directly to a central coordinator. So in those cases, maybe what you want to do is have more of a diffusive kind of algorithm where nodes just talk to other nodes that are close to them, right, via small local range communication links. And then hopefully when they talk, they have this sort of iterative process where information slowly spreads through the network over time, as opposed to being sent directly to some central coordinator. So this is an example of a very simple algorithm that allows diffusion. The idea is very simple. Like I said, at every time step, t, okay, each node wakes up, it broadcasts its current value, listens to the values broadcasted by its neighbors, and just averages those values. And it's just going to update its value to be that average. Okay, so I've got a temperature measurement, you've got a temperature measurement. I wake up, I listen, you guys all broadcast your current estimate of the average. I just update my value to be that average. Right, very basic. You can capture that via this mathematical equation, right? So these WIIs and WIJs just specify some weights. It's like 1 over the total number of nodes, for example. And it turns out that as long as the network is connected and you keep doing this over and over again, you can prove that all the values of all the nodes will in fact converge to the same value. And that could be the average. It depends on the topology of the network and the weights. Okay, so it's a very simple algorithm. Basically says if you just average with your own neighbors, eventually you're going to all compute the same value. So this is kind of an illustration of the trajectories of the values of all the nodes, right? So even if they start out with a pretty big spread in terms of their initial values, just by doing local averaging over time, they all converge to the same value. Okay, and so this obviously has applications in sensor networks, but it also has applications for multi-robot flocking and things like this, right? So everybody starts out facing in some random direction. They all update their headings to be the average of their neighbor's heading. So you can sort of see biologically inspired flocking behavior that comes out of this. So far, so good. All right. So what happens if there's even one node that decides, hey, I'm not going to update my value, right, according to the average of my neighbor's value. So I'm going to be stubborn. I like my value, and I'm just going to stick with it. Okay, so in that case, turns out if there's even one stubborn node in the network, so could be a fault, right? It just never chooses to update its value. It turns out that if everybody else in the network updates their values based on this averaging scheme, they will all eventually converge to the value of the stubborn node. Okay, so you can see parallels in opinion dynamics, for example, right? So just one stubborn individual in the entire system can maybe eventually bring everybody to their point of view. So this is not great if you were to think about a resilient system. So if you're going to deploy a sensor network and you want everybody to be getting, averages of certain quantities that they're measuring, a single sensor that gets stuck at a certain value is going to mess up the entire system when you follow this algorithm. Okay, so when you think about this idea of consensus with faulty nodes or adversaries, this goes back a long, long way. So computer science has looked at this from the 1970s and 80s, right? So they call it the Byzantine general problem. Control systems and communications communities have started to look at this this is stuff that I did during my PhD, so the last couple decades. Sociology, economics, as you might imagine, has looked at this quite a bit, right, in the context of social networks. So there's a few key kind of considerations that come into play when we talk about being resilient. So if you were to say, resilient is a pretty popular word now, but it's quite vague, right? What does it mean to be resilient? So if somebody comes to me and says, hey, we want to design a resilient algorithm, there are certain questions that, I'm going to ask them, right? So the first question is, when you have nodes that aren't going to follow whatever algorithm you want them to follow, what do the good guys know, right? What do the nodes that actually follow the algorithm know? Do you want them to know a lot of information, so the entire network topology, or do you want them to only know their neighbors in the network? Similarly, do you want the good guys to know what everybody else is supposed to be doing, or do you want them to only know what they're supposed to be doing, right? So if you give the good guys more power, obviously you can overcome broader classes of misbehavior. On the other hand, that may be too much to ask, or it may require a lot of computation, right? So that comes down to how much computation and storage are you allowing the good nodes to have? Are you allowing them to gather all the data that they've ever seen and do really complicated calculations on them? Or do you want them to have very little computation and very little storage on board and to do very, myopic computations? Again, what the answer to this is going to dictate what you're able to tolerate in terms of misbehavior. What are the objectives for the normal nodes, right? So you nominally want them to calculate something like the average, but are you okay with them computing something close to the average? Okay, and so if you are, then maybe you can tolerate wider classes of misbehavior. Okay, that's for the good guys. What about the bad guys, right? What kinds of misbehavior do you want to tolerate? So do you want to just tolerate nodes that drop out of the network, so they just fail and they stop broadcasting? Those are called crashes in the literature. Or maybe nodes that update their states according to some known model, right? So if I know, hey, if the node fails, it's just going to broadcast the same value over and over again. That's a model for misbehavior. And those are sometimes called faulty nodes, right? They're not really doing the most harm they could to your network. They're just crashing or failing in a known way. On the other hand, you could also have nodes that do arbitrarily bad things, right? Just update their values completely randomly, not according to some model, or try and really mess up the system in a way. So if you got an adversary that compromises the system, they hack into your network, they compromise certain nodes, and then they make the nodes update their values or broadcast values in such a way that they're trying to bring the rest of the network down. That would fall into these more adversarial settings called malicious or Byzantine nodes. Okay, so that's what the bad guys do. How many bad guys do you want to tolerate, right? So do you want up to F bad guys in the entire network? That's called an F total model. Or do you want to be able to tolerate up to F bad guys in the neighborhood of every good node, right? So that could potentially allow a huge number of bad guys, because that could scale with the size of the network. Like you can imagine, that's also harder to rate. So these are sort of some of the key questions that, at least based on my, couple of decades working in this field, kind of end up being a key checklist for me to go through when I'm trying to figure out how to make a network resilient, right? When we're trying to do this distributed data inference and processing. So if we go back to the computer science literature, here are some of the key kinds of metrics they look at when they're trying to design a network that's resilient to a certain kind of misbehavior. So suppose that we look at this kind of network here. It's got just 4 nodes, right, working in this cycle here. And suppose that node 1 wants to obtain node 3's value. So node 3's measured something, and node 1 wants to know what that measurement is. Now, in this network, there's only 2 ways for information to flow from node 3 to node 1, right? It has to go through either node 2 or through node 4. Now, suppose node 2 says, I don't want node 1 to know what node 3's value is. Okay, and so node 2 is going to follow whatever algorithm, but it's going to pretend that node 3 told it its value is 9 rather than 7. Okay, and node 4 is going to behave correctly and do what it's supposed to do. So now node 1 is going to get conflicting information from node 2 and node 4, right? So whenever it's looking at information from node 2, it seems to be consistent with node 3 having a value of 9. And whenever it gets information from node 4, it seems to be consistent with node 3 having a value of 7. And if it's got no a priori reason to believe one versus the other, it'll never have a way to break that deadlock, right? So in this case, in this network, a single bad guy is able to prevent another part of the network from learning the true information that was gathered in a different part of the network, right? And so the key challenge here is that you need more paths in this network for information to flow so that the node 1 can have a tiebreaker, right, to figure out who's lying and who's. So in graph theory, this is captured by a concept called connectivity, graph connectivity. So if I give you a graph, again, a set of nodes and edges, and between those nodes, the connectivity of the graph is defined as the smallest number of nodes that you have to remove to disconnect the graph. Okay, so if I were to give you this graph, for example, what's the smallest number of nodes I have to remove so that the remaining nodes are disconnected from each other? That would be 1, right? If I take this out, they can't talk to each other. Similarly here, this graph has connectivity too. If I remove any single node, the other nodes still have paths between them. So I'd have to remove 2 nodes to make the resulting leftover network disconnected. And here, for example, connectivity is 3. Okay. And so the set of disconnecting nodes is called a vertex cut. And there's this sort of fundamental theorem in graph theory called Menger's theorem, which basically says that the connectivity of the graph is also the number of different routes in the graph between any pair of nodes. So for example, here, right, this graph has connectivity 3. Between any pair of nodes, there's 3 different paths in the network to get between those nodes. And based on that example we just talked about, the availability of multiple different paths in the network is really important for sending information reliably in these networks, right? So you can see why connectivity might be a key concept. So then there's this classical result, which basically says that if there are up to F malicious nodes in the network, right, so an F total model, all the nodes can reliably exchange information if and only if the network is 2F+1 connected. So if there's 2F+1 different paths in the network, and there's only F bad guys, they can only compromise F of those paths. So F+1 paths still carry correct information. And so you can imagine there's going to be some sort of algorithm. A simple one would be just send information along these 2F+1 different paths. The receiver waits, gathers those 2F+1 pieces of information. At most, F of them are going to be compromised. So if I do majority voting on the information I get, I'm going to be able to figure out what the true information is. Okay, but this requires some assumptions, right? So this kind of simple algorithm I prescribed to you is like, I'm going to send information from here to Songlin, right? And it's going to go through different paths in the network, and Songlin is going to basically do majority voting. But then I need to know that there's somebody named Songlin who's looking for my information in the network. And I need to know that there's 2F+1 paths, and I need to be able to send along those different paths. So this goes back to that question of what did the good guys know, right? If they knew the entire network, then they could potentially leverage these redundant paths to be able to send information. But if I don't know the identities or the topology of the network, I can't really do that. But this is sort of a fundamental result. So some of the research that has been going on in the field and that we've done a lot of work on is really looking at the other side of the spectrum, where we're looking for scalable algorithms. So if you want to be able to scale this to thousands or even millions of nodes in a network, right, where things may be changing over time, we don't want to be relying on assumptions like the network is fixed and I know the identities of other people and so forth. So how do we think about these scalable algorithms? And if you have any questions as we go, just feel free to stop. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what my question is. It's if we're thinking of like a majority rule approach to like the local neighborhood, what role does uncertainty in the measurement have in consensus?
Wonderful. Yeah. So if you're measuring, for example, temperature, right, you might measure 4.5 and you might measure 4.9 and you might measure 2. Right now, there's no majority vote. It's not like two people are saying 4.5. So there you could use something like a median. So essentially, if you have uncertainty there are certain statistical measures that approximate the majority vote that deal with that. Yeah. And I'll talk, the algorithm I'll prescribe now has a little bit of that flavor. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Okay. So let's think about a simple way to make these kinds of algorithms more resilient. Okay, so one thing that we said before was, okay, the simple kind of averaging algorithm, I wake up every day, I just look at my neighbors, I average all their values. Okay, now suppose I knew that there could be up to F bad guys in my neighborhood, right? So I don't know who they are, but F of my friends are malicious and they're trying to mess me up. So what I should do then is, instead of averaging all my nodes, my neighbors' values, right? Think of these as opinions. It's usually easier to think of it that way. Instead of averaging the opinions of all my friends, I have crazy friends. Everybody has crazy friends. I'm going to ignore the craziest of them, right? So I'm going to throw away the F highest and F lowest values in my neighborhood and only average the rest. Okay, so that's called a trimmed mean in robust statistics. So there's a whole field of robust statistics, which is basically how do I deal with data whose statistics may vary across a wide range and make robust inferences based on that. Okay, so the update equation looks exactly the same as before, except now instead of averaging all my neighbors' values, this is just my moderate neighbors' values. So what happens here, right? So this seems like a very simple modification. So it's interesting then to do a thought experiment and think about what conditions on the network are required to be able to guarantee that this kind of algorithm still spreads information reliably. Remember, in the previous case, all that was required was that the network is connected. As long as there's a path from everybody else, just averaging will work. So let's think about a network that looks like this, right? So you've got a bunch of nodes here and nodes. And let's say you've got n/2 nodes clustered together over there, n/2 nodes clustered together over here. Everybody can talk to everybody else over there. Everybody can talk to everybody else over here, okay? And suppose that each node here can talk to exactly one node in the other set. because the network is set up this way. It's a very kind of esoteric network, but it's a thought experiment. Now, suppose that every node here measures 0, has an opinion of 0, and every node here has an opinion of 1. And we follow this algorithm where every node is going to throw away the highest and lowest in its neighborhood before averaging the rest, okay? So what would happen here, right? So this node, for example, would look at all its neighbors. It would say 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. It's going to throw away the highest and lowest, so it'll throw away a 1, and we're going to throw away 0. Average the rest, it's going to stay at 0, right? And similarly, every node here is going to stay at 1. So you can see here in this network, which is beautifully connected from the perspective of that graph connectivity metric I talked about, right? Each node is connected to half the other nodes in the network here. By doing this very simple local filtering, throwing away of extreme values, you are basically having each node throw away the only information it's getting from outside its own set. And so it's never able to break through this sort of, clique that it's found itself in terms of changing its value or its opinion. Okay, so that doesn't seem great, right? So this simple modification makes it seem like, information won't spread even in this new network. So then at that point, we looked at this and we said, okay, so should we go further with this? It seems like it's not going to work very well. But then we asked, okay, what properties of graphs would allow information to spread using a simple algorithm like this, right? Because it's a very basic, simple algorithm. So what was the problem here? The problem here, as I said, was that under this algorithm, each node was throwing away the only useful information it was getting from outside its own set. So can we come up with a new graph property that would allow us to capture situations where that cannot happen, right? So you don't throw away all of the information you're getting from outside your set. Okay, so I'm going to define a couple of things here, and this is going to be illustrated through examples, so hopefully be clear. So suppose I give you a graph, right? So I give you this kind of network, and I give you some subset of nodes, like some S, okay? And I'm going to say that set is R reachable if that set has a node inside that has at least R neighbors outside. Let's do examples. So for example, this set of nodes right here is 3 reachable because it's got a node, in this case B5, that has at least 3 neighbors outside that set. Okay, and this set right here is 4 reachable because it's got a node, in this case B7, that has at least 4 neighbors outside that set. Okay, so if I give you a set and I ask if you, is it R reachable, you would say, is there a node inside that has R neighbors outside? Why is that useful? Because again, remember, we're throwing away values, right? Each node is throwing away a certain number of values. So we want to be able to quantify how many neighbors a certain node has outside its set, because we want to say, is it throwing away all of the information it's going to be getting? Okay, so that's a set property, but we want to make sure that there's no subset of nodes that kind of get stuck without getting information from outside. So we say a graph is R robust if for every pair of subsets of nodes, at least one of those subsets is R reachable. Okay, and so if we look here at this graph, no matter how I break this graph into 2 subsets, at least one of these subsets is going to be 3 reachable. Okay, and so then this graph is said to be R robust. So if I give you a graph, checking whether a graph is R robust is, is a certain property of that graph. So it turns out that for this algorithm that I described, where you're just throwing away, F highest, F lowest, and averaging the rest, if the graph is 2F plus 1 robust, then that algorithm is guaranteed to succeed. Essentially, you won't run into these bottlenecks where you can find these 2 cliques of nodes where each clique is throwing away all the useful information it's getting from outside and preventing the algorithm from converging. So before, it used to be 2F plus 1 connected was the key consideration. Now you have this robustness condition. Okay, and remember, this robustness condition is generally stronger than connectivity. So this kind of explains or exemplifies this spectrum, right? So essentially, if you are at one side where you allow your nodes to know a lot of information, do a lot of computation, there's certain redundancy requirements that show up on the network. But if you were to throw that away and you were to reduce the amount of computation and knowledge that the nodes have, you're going to have to pay a price. And what is that price? You're going to have more redundancy in terms of the network, more conditions. And so these kinds of results show you how to navigate through that spectrum of how to design reliable networks based on the constraints that you might have. Okay, any questions about that? So this is kind of an example of the trajectories that you might follow, right? So all of these non-bolded lines right here, maybe the normal nodes. So they're following their trajectories. They're throwing away highest and lowest and averaging the rest. The bad guys, which are shown with these bolded lines here, they're limited in what they can do. They can choose any value they want. They can transmit any value they want. But if they were to transmit a value that's too large, what's going to happen? It's going to get thrown away because they're going to be extreme in the neighborhood. So they can do what they want, but they're kind of stuck in between the ranges of the values of the good nodes. And as the values of the good nodes converge, the range of things that the bad guys can do is also limited. Okay? So that kind of explains what's happening in these kinds of algorithms. Okay, and so similar ideas translate to distributed optimization. So I'll skip through that. Okay, and then it turns out it's kind of interesting. You might ask, well, you've come up with this new graph condition. Again, it seems like it's a really strong condition. So is it worth studying this algorithm at all? So that's something we looked at. And so when we think about sort of real world networks, quote unquote, large networks, so you can think about power grids and social networks and other kinds of networks, the framework of random graphs ends up being a very nice way to study those, because essentially it's a way to think about these big networks and generating networks that have properties similar to real world networks, but in a statistical way, in a mathematical way, right? So as an example, right, if I were to tell you guys, okay, I'd like you to go home and I'd like you to create a network that looks like Facebook, right? What does that mean? Let's say 1 billion nodes. You have to go home, you have to create 1 billion nodes, and you have to put edges between the nodes. And I want you to come back to me tomorrow with a file that contains this network you made up. And I should be able to not tell the difference. I shouldn't be able to tell if I had the Facebook network and I had your network, I shouldn't be able to tell which one's the real network and which one's not. So how would you create a network? How would you put edges between these nodes in order to make it so that it looks plausible as something like the Facebook network, right? So somebody might say, well, I'm going to put edges between every pair of nodes. If you did that, I could easily tell that it's not Facebook, right? Because obviously not everybody is connected to everybody else on Facebook. Somebody might say, well, I'm going to pick one node and put edges from them to everybody else. I'd say that's not Facebook, right? There isn't one single person that's friends with everybody. So how would you do that? And so, there are a variety of random graph models where you put edges randomly between nodes, but chosen in such a way that it mimics what you might see in the groups. Amazingly, it turns out that for a lot of these random graph models for complex networks, these ideas of robustness and connectivity, this classical notion of connectivity and this new notion of robustness, they coincide in these networks. So essentially, although we're able to find a network where those things were quite different, randomly chosen networks end up having them align. And so this says that there's this kind of hidden structure in these networks that we didn't know before, which may facilitate this kind of resilient information diffusion in these networks. Pretty interesting. Okay, any questions about that? Yes.
When we started talking about the R, there were two of them, R robustness and R, forget what the other R word was.
Connectivity. Yeah.
And you took a subset of the graph and we're asking the question like how many, right there.
Yeah.
Reachable, how many connected, right there, we have 4 reachable set there on the bottom left.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there any role to play in broadcasting, not just what we think the state of the world is, but what locally we think our neighbor's state of the world is? Is that like a tentative pre-consensus sort of thing?
Yeah.
Is that happening, or
Not in this
we
case.
haven't got there yet?
Well, so it's unclear whether that would help. Certainly, one could propose an algorithm like that. It might be interesting to think about it. Because the bad guys could do anything, including mimicking or corrupting what you're broadcasting as your kind of what you think your neighborhood consensus is. So it's unclear whether it would help. It would certainly be an algorithm to look at.
Because we want to trust our neighbors, but just the naive sort of limited mean where we're just cutting off some subset of the edges.
Mm-hmm.
What you said earlier was that we're like oftentimes throwing away the only information we have from other little clusters. And by having some kind of pre-consensus sent along with our own local opinion, there's an opportunity for information to get in.
Potentially, yeah. But the challenge there is that the bad guys could corrupt that pre-consensus information to bias the good guys towards potentially accepting the values that the bad guys are sending.
Okay.
Right. And so the challenge becomes, because this is dealing with potentially worst case adversarial behavior. So the guarantee that comes out of this is that if the network has a result of the redundancy properties captured by this condition, you can tolerate, the good guys will reach consensus. It'll be in some certain range. And it'll do that despite F local Byzantine nodes. So F local means you can have up to F bad guys in every neighborhood. So you can have a huge number of faulty nodes or adversarial nodes in the network. And those adversarial nodes could be Byzantine. Byzantine is essentially the worst case adversary model. They can do
From selectively lying to my neighbors.
selectively lying. They're allowed to coordinate with each other. They're allowed to have been chosen by an adversary up front to try and do the most damage in the network. And they're allowed to know the private information of every other good node in the network.
Okay,
And they will
so
crack cryptography as well. So essentially unbound computation.
if everybody was well behaved, that would be a really robust way of trying to propagate information, but in the worst case scenario,
Yes.
all we're doing is extending the blast radius.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But this could be conservative, right? So because if you don't have these F local bad guys in the network, you've engineered your system to be able to tolerate that. So that's why in that kind of questionnaire of what do you mean resilient, if you chose, look, I have no idea, well, you got to pay the price in terms of performance. But if it ended up being crash failures, this is sort of overkill. So yeah, but the key thing in resilient network design is to justify your assumptions. So if somebody came to me and said, my assumption is that the bad guys follow this model, my natural question would be why? Like, why are you assuming that? Is that a reasonable assumption?
Is there a subset of the research in this area that makes a completely different assumption and has like, instead of not trusting their neighbors, the entire network is 100% trust and all the focus is based on how to deactivate trust on a node?
Yep, there is. Yeah, so the traditional perspective on these things is fault detection, identification, isolation. So you detect if something is going wrong, you identify who's going wrong, and you isolate them from the network. That works if you've got certain models for misbehavior. So for example, if I see that somebody's broadcasting the same value over and over and over again, if I know something about the network, I could say, well, at least after 25 times, they should have changed their value. Maybe they're keeping their value constant because their friends are doing something. But there may be ways to detect that kind of misbehavior. With Byzantine nodes, it turns out that it's fundamentally impossible to detect who's Byzantine if you don't have an a priori assumption about the data. And the reason for that is as follows. So imagine everybody in this room picks a value, right, between 0 and 10. Okay, nature gives you some value, you're measuring something. And suppose there's no correlation between our values. It could actually be anything between 0 and 10. Okay, now suppose it happens that everybody gets a value of 0. Okay, that's what nature actually gives us. But you choose to pretend that you got a value of 10. And you participate in this algorithm that we follow. Now, you're participating assuming by pretending your value is 10. How will anybody ever know whether your value was actually 10 or whether your value is 0 and you changed the value? And that's because there's no a priori distribution or correlation between those values. So from that perspective, it's impossible for me to know whether you're Byzantine or not. And that's why that leads to this kind of inherently paranoid algorithm, which is I'm never trusting anybody because of their identity. I'm making decisions purely on the data. Now, you could ask about trust. So there's a whole subfield that's dedicated to trust-based decision-making, which is if you've done well in the past, I'm going to trust you more in the future, right? I might build up a trust score. So this again comes back to what are your assumptions about the adversary's objectives? Every movie I've seen has a spy that infiltrates the organization, builds trust, and then compromises at the opportune time. Right? So if your objective is to say always, no matter when I'm running this thing, a bad guy can never compromise me, trust may not work because past behavior may not be indicative of future behavior in such situations. However, if the model is that adversaries have compromised certain nodes, but there's going to be some sort of, telltale sign over history, then trust may help. Comes down to the model. Yeah. So definitely vast literature on this topic. Yeah, great questions. Any other questions on that? Yeah.
So I assume in the same way that this can handle the Byzantine nodes, this is also robust against picking up like local perturbations. So it would be hard to have a new variable like propagate through
Right,
unless a certain number of nodes pick up that new.
exactly. Exactly. So networks are a double-edged sword. So networks are great because they allow information that a small number of nodes have to inform other parts of the network, but they also allow misinformation from a small number of nodes to propagate to the rest of the network. And how do you tell the difference between a few bad guys who pretend there's a perturbation, right? Fire, 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 deploy all your emergency resources to that part when there's no fire, versus actual fire, please deploy emergency resources. So if you have to be, if there's the potential for your network to have that kind of compromise in it, essentially what that means is you have to build in enough redundancy in your network. And what does redundancy mean? How do you measure redundancy? Comes down to how you're diffusing information. So that's all this is. Yep. Okay. What's the time like? How am I, when should I stop? I guess it's 1:15. You guys go to 1:30 or should I go?
1:30.
1:30? Okay. Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about, I'm not sure how far I'll get in this, but I want to, talk a little bit about other classes of problems that that show up here. And so we'll see how far we get. So this is called distributed hypothesis testing, right? So the prior problem we talked about was a consensus problem. It's just get everybody to agree on something. This is also getting everybody to agree on something, but in this case, it's not just that everybody has some initial value and they're trying to compute the average or something of that. Suppose that we have a setting where the state of the world could be in one of m different configurations, right? So theta 1 through theta m is a set of possible states of the world, okay? Now, one of these states is the true state of the world, okay? So is something happening or not, right? Or is, one of these m things happening in the system? One of them is actually happening, but we don't know which one. We want to figure out what's happening. Okay, so we have this network, and it's a sensor network. And so each agent or sensor in this network receives signals, right? It's measuring the state of this world, and it's going to be receiving signals over time. And so we're going to be denoting the signals measured by agent I as SIT. So that's a signal that agent I measures at time t. And that's drawn from some set, right? Depends on the type of signals it's measuring. And there's some, we assume some standard properties about the distribution of that signal. Now, for each hypothesis theta, for each possible state of the world, the distribution of the signals that the agent gets is captured by some function Li. Okay, and I'll give you an example to show you what this means. But essentially, this is a characterization of the sensor. So if this were the true state of the world, the sensor will be seeing this distribution of signals. On the other hand, if this were the true state of the world, the sensor will be seeing a different distribution of signals in terms of what it's measuring. Okay, so this is basically capturing the probability with which the sensor will see a certain value, Wi, if theta were the true state of the world. So that's what that likelihood function captures. Now, what we would like is for all the agents to be able to work together to figure out what is the true state of the world. They want to be able to identify theta star. Okay, so what they're going to be doing in this class of problems is that they maintain what's called a belief vector. And that's basically just a probability distribution over the set of states. So for example, at the beginning, maybe they think all the states are equally likely, right? So they put a uniform distribution 1 over m on every state. But they'd like to update that belief vector over time based on the signals they're getting and information that they're getting from their neighbors. And what we'd like to be able to do is design a belief update rule, which ensures that everybody learns a true state. What does that mean? That this belief vector converges to a distribution, which is a 1 on the true state and 0 everywhere else, right? So they converge to like 100% probability of the true state and 0 everywhere else. Okay, so how do we do that? So this is, this is in a different context, but you can imagine a sensor network and there's some objects that are in this environment and they want to classify what kinds of objects there are, right? So maybe these are animals, or in a battlefield, it could be, enemy assets or something like that. Okay, so, I'll talk about how these people think about these algorithms and a very kind of embarrassingly simple way to solve this kind of problems. So this is an example to illustrate these notions that I just talked about. So suppose that we have a single agent. Let's not worry about a network for a second. And suppose there are 3 possible hypotheses, right? So theta 1, theta 2, and theta 3 are the possible things that can be true. And the agent is going to be seeing heads or tails. That's the signal structure of the agent. If theta 1 were true, it's going to see heads with probability 3/4 and tails with probability 1/4. It's going to see a sequence of coin flips, okay? But the coin is going to land heads with probability 3/4 if the true state of the world is theta 1. If the true state is theta 2, it's going to see heads and tails with equal probability. And if the true state is theta 3, it's going to be the same as when it was theta 1. Okay. So let's do an example here. So each row of this is a conditional distribution. All right, so we flip a coin and we see tails. What do you think? Is it more likely to be theta 1 or theta 2 or theta 3? 2. Why?
Because the possibility being a tail is 50% from the other than the purpose.
Exactly, right? So here, if you had an equal likelihood of distribution prior over all three of these, it's very unlikely you'd have seen a tails there. So if you see a tails, it's probably more likely to be theta 2. Okay, but we keep flipping. Then we see heads. So they might say, well, still seems like theta 2, right? Because you should be seeing heads and tails equally often. So then you keep flipping, right? So you see tails, heads. Okay, looks like theta 2. Oh, wait a minute. So now we're seeing more heads, right? And now your belief that it's theta 1 or theta 3 starts to shift, right? That maybe you start to believe it's more theta 1 or theta 3. You can never tell whether it's theta 1 or theta 3 because those are identical in terms of the distributions you're seeing, right, of those signals. But you can start to believe that it's probably not theta 2 by seeing this long, string of signals. Okay, so, you can see sort of how these agents, based on their local signals, may be able to rule out certain states, right? So they can start to say, maybe it's not theta 2, but they may not be able to identify the true state just based on their own signals, because their sensors are not rich enough to be able to tell apart certain kinds of states in this world. Okay, so this is if you haven't seen this before, and even if you've seen it before, this is the kind of slide you put up to impress your friends, right? That you do complicated math. I hate this notation. There's vertical lines everywhere for no reason, but this is called the chaos divergence in information theory. And all this function does is that it eats two probability distributions and it tells you how different. That's all it does. And it does that by doing this kind of computation, okay? But generally speaking, if I want to be able to figure out which states can I tell apart, I want to look at their distributions, right? That the signals that are generated, and I want to see how different they are. These two distributions are exactly the same, so I can't tell them apart. These two distributions are different, so I can tell them apart. And if they're very different, the easier it is for me to tell them apart. Okay, so this KL divergence is basically a way to capture how different these distributions are. Okay, so how do people solve this kind of problem? So remember, just locally, agents may not be able to tell apart certain signals. So they have to rely on the other members of the network to be able to do that. So how do we blend information from multiple sensors, multiple agents, in order to be able to resolve this ambiguity? So there's a variety of different rules that people have proposed. Let me, kind of walk you through the intuition here. So this right here is basically Bayes' rule. If people have taken probability or are familiar with Bayes' rule, right? So the idea is that each agent maintains a distribution, right? Which is basically, what is the probability that I think that theta is the true state? If I get a new signal at time t+1, I'm going to use Bayes' rule to basically update my distribution, okay? My belief that this is the true state. That's just me doing things locally, but now I have to include information from my neighbors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my neighbors for what they think is the probability that theta is a true state. And this says just average it, right? So I'm going to do Bayes' rule, get a new local belief, and I'm going to average that with the beliefs of my neighbors. So this looks very similar to the consensus problem we looked at before, okay? Other people have looked at what are called log linear rules. This looks even more complicated, but it turns out if you take the log, it comes to the same thought. It ends up being a little bit faster. But essentially, this is all some way of averaging information from your neighbors. And it turns out that under pretty basic conditions, right, on the network and the signal structures, this works. Everybody will guarantee convergence. So essentially, as long as there's some pair, for every pair of hypotheses, somebody in the network can tell them apart. That's one condition. The network is connected, so information has to be able to flow between nodes. That's the second condition. And conditions on priors. Everybody should start out by assuming anything is possible, right? So if you wake up and say there's 0% chance the Earth is round, no matter what I tell you, I'm not able to convince you, right? So you have to start with some non-zero prior. As long as that's true, and these other two conditions are true, these rules will guarantee convergence. Okay, so let me show you in, I guess, the next 6 minutes that you can do this in an embarrassingly simple way. These are not the best ways to do it. First question is, this is the second key insight about networks. Networks are useful. They're a double-edged sword, however, because you have to worry about how to incorporate information from your neighbors. To the extent that you can, you should maybe not rely on other people, right? Do things on your own, be self-sufficient, and rely on other people or other nodes in the network for stuff you cannot do. So if we think about it that way, let's see what each node in the network can do based purely on its own information. Suppose it says there are other people in the network, but I don't want to talk to them. Why should I talk to them? Let me see what I can do on my own. In that case, what it can do is it can use Bayes' rule just locally, right? It's just getting information, it's updating its beliefs using Bayes' rule, which is like a standard approach to doing probability theory. And like we saw before, it turns out with Bayes' rule, you can show certain things. So remember, theta star is the true state. That's actually what's generating the signals, okay? I'm looking at the signals that I'm getting. I'm looking at the distribution of the signals that I'm getting. And you can see that if theta is a state that's not observationally equivalent to theta star, I'm eventually going to be able to rule it out because I'm seeing a certain distribution of signals. Under theta, I would have been seeing a different distribution of signals. And so just like the example that we did, if I wait long enough, I should be able to say, this is not the same distribution I'm seeing. So it's very unlikely that this is the true state. That's what we did with theta 2, right, in that example we saw before. On the other hand, if theta is observationally equivalent, so those two states generate the same distributions, I can never rule it out, okay? So the key insight here is just by looking at its own signals, each agent can rule out a certain subset of states, but it cannot conclusively determine which state is true. So this is just a visual interpretation of that exact same example we did earlier, right? So in this case, this agent can never distinguish between theta 1 and theta 3 because they're both the distributions are exactly the same under those two states, but it can distinguish theta 2 from theta 1 and theta 2 from theta 3. In this case, if theta 1 is the true state, this is what the beliefs will look like after those coin flips that we saw before, right? In that case, we did start out thinking, well, theta 2 might be true, but then as the number of coin flips got bigger and bigger, right, we said, okay, this is unlikely to be true, and these two I cannot distinguish. All right, so the key question is, now that this agent can rule out certain things like theta 2, how do I leverage information from others to figure out whether theta 1 or theta 3 is? And so this is where this embarrassingly simple idea comes from. So each person in this room has ruled out certain states. How do we figure out which state is true? Okay, well, if you tell me a certain state is false, and you tell me a certain different state is false, and you tell me a different state is false, whatever is left behind must be true, right? So this is just the process of elimination. So what I want to do is allow low beliefs on hypotheses, which basically means you're ruling out a certain state. I want low beliefs to spread quickly throughout the network. How do I allow low beliefs to spread throughout the network? I'm going to take the minimum of my friends' beliefs at each time as opposed to averaging. So I listen to all of you and I say, for this theta, which one of you has the lowest belief on that theta? And I'm going to adopt that belief because you having a low belief means you're probably ruled out that belief, that state based on your local signals. Okay, and so this basically leads to this kind of update rule where you do local Bayes rule, and then you update your network belief or your global belief based on taking the minimum of your friends' beliefs and your own belief, and then normalizing that. Okay, so and it turns out that this works. Hopefully this is embarrassingly simple, right, and obvious in terms of how it works. Under the same conditions as before, you can show that this rule also works. And furthermore, again, a very complicated looking expression, all this says is that it learns faster than the existing rules. Okay, so in some of these situations, it's worth stepping back and thinking about what do networks of sensors bias, right? And they allow us to have different sensors that have access to different kinds of information. And how do we effectively leverage expert opinion or expert information in this network and allow it to spread through the network quickly? Averaging will work, but there's no reason to average an expert's opinion with somebody who has no idea what they're talking about. That's what consensus does. Having this kind of min rule allows actual valuable information to spread. Okay, and it turns out, you can do this with bad guys and everything like that, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Okay, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Well, this is a lot of information to process here. And also, I have to say this, you brought some of the nightmares back to me when I did a stats degree. A lot of maximum likelihood stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully it was understandable and easy to follow, but yeah.
I do have a question related to this. You currently, most of this is talking about this in a single network.
Yes.
Listening to you and thinking about some of the research that we do, especially in the natural resources. We have networks of networks.
Yes.
And so, as simple as above ground vegetation, there's below ground vegetation, that we have it. Above ground, there's the vertical connection and all of that. Yeah. Look, and I'm not, expecting you give me immediate answer, but it's, what are the, tools that we can have?
Absolutely. So there's two aspects there. So I don't have it here, I think. So there's this random K-partite graph. So we actually have a paper that talks about multi-layer networks and networks of networks. And it turns out, you could look for the same kinds of redundancy conditions in those networks as well. So you can imagine, at this layer, there's some sort of probability distribution over the connections between the networks. At this layer, there's a different distribution because of a different kind of network, and you may have connections between them. Or you can have essentially the same nodes participating in multiple networks, but in different ways, right? So in a social network, for example, I have a friendship network, which looks a certain way. I have a family network, which looks a different way. I have a professional network, which looks a different way. So I may be participating in the same network in different ways. So there's two things that we've done there. One is, what additional structure does this multi-layer network structure bring to the problem? And you can look for the same exact kinds of conditions there. There's also interesting things where we've done work in the context of epidemics and opinions. So now think about people, and they're participating in two different networks. One is the opinion network. So how severe is COVID or something, right? And then the second one is the contact network. So this is how COVID actually spreads. So, and of course, the precautions that you take are going to be a function of both, right? So if I see a lot of my friends actually have COVID, maybe I'm going to take it, I'm going to do something. Or if I have a lot of friends who have certain opinions about COVID, I'm going to do something. And the interplay between these different kinds of processes spreading on these different networks affects the dynamics on both networks. So we've also done work that looks at that interplay between those networks. So there's certainly a lot of work that people have done in general as well. Yeah, very, very interesting area. Yeah, and you can look at the same thing in transportation networks. So if you've got the airline network and the ground transportation network, right, if there's a perturbation in the airline network, then people are going to take ground travel, and that might cause ground congestion. Very interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Any other question?
If people are interested, I am teaching a network class this fall, Structure and Dynamics of Large-Scale Networks as an ECE course. So you're welcome to sit in on it if you'd like. Just send me an email. I'm happy to tell you information about that. So we'll talk about random graph models and game theoretic models and dynamics and all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, let's thank Dr. Sandura.
Get out of this PowerPoint, Nancy, or leave it open?